As I mentioned, this week is Dying Matters Awareness Week, and we did some actual in person events back in 2018 and 2019 to mark the occasion. We had to cancel, unfortunately, our events this time last year. I'm sure you all are aware of why that is. And this year, we have set ourselves up to run some digital events to bring to you. We ran one on Tuesday, and it was a panel event introducing other colleagues in the funeral industry. It went really, really well. And that one is also going to be available on our YouTube channel for you to watch in case you missed any of it. So, the theme of Dying Matters Awareness Week this year is Are You in a Good Place to Die? And we really like that theme here at Freeman Brothers because it allows us to talk about what we do and help people to discuss funerals and funeral planning prior to the end of their lives. So I will hand over to Abby, who will introduce herself and her role at Freeman Brothers and sort of bring us up to speed to where the company was by the time I joined. Over to you, Abby.
Thanks, Becky. Morning, everyone. Hello, my name's Abby Pattenden, and I'm the manager of Freeman Brothers Funeral Directors. I'm based in our office in Horsham. As you may be aware, we also have three other branches, one in Billingshurst, one in Southgate in Crawley, and our most recent addition is in Hurstpit Point. I've been working for the company for about 14 years now, and I was basically recruited when my predecessor wanted to retire. The company is still run by the same family who's been in charge of it since its inception in 1855. So my current boss, Peter Freeman, who's the proprietor of the company, is the fifth generation of his family to run the business. What's quite interesting is that he's also a direct descendant of the original proprietor, Bede Freeman, and that's quite unusual actually. You sometimes tend to find that even if a funeral business, or I suppose any other family business probably, has stayed within the family, quite often you might find that there has been sort of a marrying in, or a nephew has somehow got involved somewhere along the way, but actually we're in the direct line, and his son Wilf, who is the sixth generation, now also works for the family business as well. I suppose we have evolved very gradually over time, really. So like a lot of funeral directors, the original proprietor, Bede Freeman, was not only a funeral director, and in fact not even really a funeral director as much as a lot of things, of which carrying out funerals was one. He was a carpenter and a general builder by trade, and that's quite common actually. A lot of the roots of funeral directing are found in that way, because obviously what things do you need for funerals? You need wood to make a coffin, you need transport, which in the earliest days would have been horse-drawn transport, and you need strong men to carry coffins and dig holes in the ground, and that's what a builder would have had. By the First World War, Bede's sons had taken over the business, and he died in 1915, and then it carried on down the family line from one of the two Freeman brothers, who are his sons, where the name originates. So I started working in the company in 2007. At that time, things were very different with funerals, very, very different. Most people had a Church of England service, even if they were perhaps not necessarily practicing. They made not necessarily a lot of choices about the content of that service, and that's something that I've really seen evolve over the time that I've been managing the company. And I think things have moved a lot quicker in the past few years. So for example, we didn't have a website when I started, whereas now it's something that we wouldn't think of not having, and we direct people to all the time. Obviously, as Becky said, things like this are very new to us, and I think to a lot of people, you know, this time, I suppose 2 years ago, we never communicated anything in this way online. We've seen people customizing things a lot more, personalizing things a lot more, and as a small business we really try to be customer responsive. So if people tell us that they would like something that we don't know if it's possible or not, we try to find it if we can. We respond to feedback when we try to find new products and new services, and just try really to meet the needs of our local, you know, we are a small local business, to meet the needs of those customers at what obviously can be really difficult time.
Great, thanks, Abby. Really interesting history for people, I'm sure, about the company. It's so unusual to still have a business which A, started in the mid 19th century, and B, is still run by the original family who set up said business. So it's an increasingly rare thing to be a part of, and it does feel really special to me as someone who joined the business only a few years ago. So to give everyone a quick overview of what I do, my role is as our community coordinator, and I'm the first person to hold the post. It was invented back in 2017, and I joined the company then. Being a millennial, I did my research prior to the interview and was a little bit surprised to just find the website that I found and no social media presence or anything like that. And I thought it was some sort of strange test, which I passed with flying colours by correctly identifying Freeman Brothers had no social media presence. And it was only when I actually started working that I realised why and how, because at the age that I was then, I had never, and in fact I've still never taken full responsibility for organising a funeral myself. Nobody in my immediate generations has yet died, so I haven't had cause to arrange a funeral. So I was quite naive to how the funeral industry worked, and it was a huge learning experience for me and really, really interesting. My background has all been in events management. I've done all kinds of conferences, parties, that sort of thing. And so my skills were brought into the company to help us engage better with the communities around us, because as an independent family run business still, community is very genuinely really important to us. And I often say to people that we wouldn't have survived as long as we have as a business without the support of the community. So it's really important for us to support them in the same way, particularly in the last year or so, even more so. So I busily set about setting up our social media and, as I like to say, bringing the company into the 21st century. And it's been a really interesting journey developing that voice that Freeman Brothers has, because it is very challenging communicating with people about death, dying and bereavement. And it's why Dying Matters Awareness Week is so important to us. And because it allows us to have an elevated platform for this 1 week and sort of give us a bit of a jumping off point to continue through the rest of the year as a business. And in the last year, my role, like so many other people's, has been incredibly different because there's been absolutely no public in-person events. We have organised a couple of digital ones. We pre-recorded our online remembrance service, which went fantastically well. And so for us, it's been a new era and a different stage to how we operate and how we communicate with people. And our communication's never been more important, because very sadly, more and more people that have needed us in a short period of time than ever before. And people have been looking for that information online, partly because of social distancing and having to communicate with family members in different parts of the region, different parts of the country, different parts of the world even. And so for them, sharing information that is conveyed digitally has been really important, rather than waiting until it's the right time to phone someone who is a relative who lives in the US who needs to be kept in the loop about these things. It's so much easier to fire off an email or send a link to our website. So it's great that we had already set up as far as we had, and it has pushed us to evolve even further. So moving on from that point a little bit, I wanted to ask Abby what changes you've noticed within the industry in the last year, and do you think any of them are here to stay?
Well, I mean, the last year has really, I think, been incredibly challenging in a lot of ways. And one of the first things that I would say is I think we are fortunate that the pandemic didn't happen 10 or even 5 years ago, actually, because one of the really significant changes that we've seen is attendance of people at funerals virtually by what sort of tends to be called live streaming, whereby there will be a fixed camera in the service venue, and that service is broadcast live to enable people wherever they are in the world to participate. Now, this was something which was increasing in popularity before the pandemic. And it was perhaps a good thing that it was possible, but I think a lot of people weren't really sure if it was the right thing for them. And it wasn't unusual for people to fly halfway across the world, you know, from America or Australia to come to the funeral. And I think people felt that watching it online, certainly some people I think felt that it wasn't sufficient, whereas now that element of choice has been taken away from people. A lot of funerals are now live streamed, and I definitely do think that that will be something that's here to stay. And I think that is a good thing and a bad thing. I think it's a good thing for people who aren't able to travel, and that's not necessarily a long distance. I mean, you know, if someone is relatively housebound, the effort that is involved in even going for a short distance might be quite difficult for them. And so actually I think there is benefit in it. And also I think for me, you know, being environmentally conscious and thinking about carbon footprint and things like that, if people do accept that they can participate virtually, then perhaps we will get people making those less very, very long journeys, which I think, you know, some people find increasingly hard to justify. On the other side of things, I think some people do think it's not as personal, and I think people perhaps did use funerals as an excuse to make that journey and catch up with each other, and maybe that will go away a little bit now. Loads and loads of other changes though. I mean, obviously things have sort of opened up again now, but if we look back to April, May time last year, there were no services in places of worship at all. So if you were someone who would typically have had a service in a place of worship, that was taken away from you for quite a long time. The number of people that was allowed at a funeral was very, very low, sort of 4 to 6 people, really the immediate family of the person who had died only. And that led to people making some quite pragmatic decisions. So we saw quite a few people choosing a direct cremation just because they thought that, you know, potentially if you're the other side of the country and you're being told to stay at home, you have to make a decision about whether or not it's actually, and if it's only you who was going to go anyway, is it the right thing to have done? Again, direct cremations were getting more popular anyway, and although I do have some reservations about the long-term implications of them for people, and actually I think I wrote a blog about that, which is on our website, so people could have a look at that if they're, you know, interested in more of my sort of personal views about it. But I do think they've definitely got a place, particularly when there isn't anyone who is able or willing to attend a cremation service for someone. Then really the way we communicate with people, as you've already said, Becky, has really changed a tremendous amount. So unfortunately, because of social distancing, we haven't been able to welcome people into our offices in the way that we did. You know, it used to not be unusual that you would have a group of family members or friends of the person who has died to come in and arrange the funeral. You know, anything between sort of 2 to 5 people, and I've had groups of 7 and 8 people arrange funerals with me before, and you would all sit down together and have a meeting which would take a variable amount of time depending on their ability to make decisions, and also I suppose depending on different views that you might get within that group of people. So what we've had to do now, unfortunately, is that we have had to switch to telling people everything that we need to know and asking them to let us know, and actually arranging the funeral virtually remotely, and then having one person come in just to confirm everything if they need to, or even sending the paperwork by post or email to get signed and returned to us. Now, I don't think that that is something for everybody at all, but again, what it's taught us as a company who is responsive to feedback is that some people have found that beneficial, and that's been particularly the case if they're a very large group who are very sort of widely spread, because what it's enabled them to do is sort of we send out an email list of everything they need to know, and they're able to disseminate that more widely if they want to, have conversations amongst themselves and gain a consensus in ways that they, you know, if there's 10 of them and 3 are in Australia and one's in New Zealand and one's in Scotland, they would never have been all come to sit with us at the same time. And so I think we're seeing a perhaps wider range of points of view being factored into the service that gets created. And so that is definitely something that we are going to keep on doing, and we are going to offer that as a service for people, because if it is something that they would still prefer to do, we have to be flexible to people's needs. You know, I think we have to accept that perhaps not everyone wants to come to the funeral director, and obviously the reason for having to come makes that even more the case, and much as we're really proud of our offices and we feel that they aren't what you would necessarily expect, and we hope they're quite welcoming, it's obviously potentially an intimidating experience for people, and if we can alleviate that, or again help people who need to do things remotely, we're really pleased to.
Cool. Something that has really struck me in the last year is there has been a lot of chat about personalisation and increased personalisation of funerals, and that has been a theme that's been running for the funeral industry for probably the last kind of 5 to 7 years, I'd have thought, but it's really picked up this year. And the element of that I find most interesting is how, for me, there's a certain thing that's almost come full circle, because from my perspective, when I started in 2017, what I noticed that there wasn't much of was people watching a cortege. And it was quite rare, I think, that you found people lining the streets or stopping in their day when they saw a hearse and a procession, possibly because those who were interested in the funeral, as it were probably waiting at the venue for the cortege to arrive, because we didn't have a problem with capacity. Whereas we have had several occasions this year where the detail that has been more widely publicised about the funeral service is actually when the cortege is coming and which route it's going to take. We have had several quite intricately arranged and long processions that have taken a big winding loop around places that were important to the person who's died or them and their family, or gone past kind of their address or the care home that they were in, perhaps. And people have very dutifully stood outside 2 meters apart, bowed their heads, watched and waited. And I've found it incredibly moving watching some as they've left the office, because people, passers-by, have stopped or have asked us what's happening. And there have been some really interesting vehicles involved in that, which has been lovely. And there are 2 occasions that I can, in fact 3 actually, that I can really think of in Horsham. We had a line of taxis. There was a lady taxi driver who died, and so all of the taxis lined up on North Parade in Horsham, and then followed the hearse to the crematorium. We had a line of post vans, and that was the first one last April, and it was an afternoon service as well. So I think they'd all finished their deliveries for the day, and they all came in their post vans, and that was really at the height of when, as Abby mentioned, there were only the absolute immediate family members who were able to go to the service itself. So all of these people who clearly really loved this gentleman who had died, and it meant a lot to them to be involved, all lined up in their vehicles. And then there was also a young man who died on his motorbike, and a lot of his biker friends came and followed the hearse to the cemetery, and that was really moving as well. And what was an interesting development was that it was also suddenly acceptable for us to film that, and to take our phones out, which is something that we wouldn't have previously done out of respect and dignity for the person who died and for the family. We wouldn't have wanted them to think that we were using them for content, and that we were going to be taking their private moment and their memory and using it to advertise our services. Whereas actually what has happened is, and there is a 4th instance, because there was a unique hearse that we organised, and that family actually requested us to film on their behalf so that they could have the footage, and so we've now built up this really beautiful library of footage that we've got on our YouTube channel of these processions, and some of them have had a lot of views, and so that really encouraged me, and tells me that this actually is an element that people are now accepting and people want, because it's helping them to feel part of it and to feel engaged with it. And it's also taking it a step further and showing people that this is something that we can do and we can help them with if they would like. So the culmination of it all at the moment was that last December we had a service for a gentleman whose who had hoped to go on a holiday in a Volkswagen camper van. And unfortunately, he had died before that was possible. And when the family came to making the arrangements, they didn't know that it was possible to have a camper van which has actually been converted into a hearse. And so we offered them this opportunity. We said, we do know a company who can help us with this. We're happy to look into it for you. And they did. They organised with us to have a hearse and a limousine that were both Volkswagen camper vans, with a beautiful floral tribute, which was also bespoke to the gentleman. It involved his cricket bat. And they asked us to film it as well. So I went along on the funeral specifically to film, and stood as we met outside their house, and the procession moved away. And it's fantastic to be able to help people in that way. So yeah, interesting time is what it's been. And to move the conversation on, one of the things that I think, having talked about all of that, is that the funeral industry has never been more publicly visible. And in a society and in a culture that finds talking about death so challenging, I've found that really intriguing. And so I wondered, Abby, what your thoughts are on the funeral industry's increased invisibility. Let me try that again. What are your thoughts on the funeral industry's increased visibility during the pandemic?
Well, I mean, the first thing that I would say is for me, it's obviously a source of regret that we had to have something like the pandemic in order to get people to appreciate. I mean, I don't want to either hide our light under a bushel or blow our own trumpet, but the funeral industry jobs are difficult. It can be long hours. You obviously take people's emotions upon you, which can be difficult. And obviously, we have staff who are on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in case they're needed. And I think because we have always historically had a tendency to understand this idea that people don't really want to talk about what we do, to a degree, there have always been some people who've been fascinated. There'll be a person who I'll say to, oh yeah, I'm a funeral director, and you see their eyes light up and you think, you're interested. But there will be people who you say, oh, I'm a funeral director, and it's like, they can't get away from you. Absolutely, they can't get away from you quick enough. But for me, I think the increased visibility has to be beneficial apart from anything else, because I think particularly for our teams, not just in Freeman Brothers, but working for all companies across the country and the world, in fact, who are really at the sharp end of getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and putting a suit on and going into a stranger's house to collect their family member or friend who has died. I mean, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And I think some recognition of it is important, is the first thing to say. For me, it's been really, really strange, because I was never really it's particularly in the past. So, I mean, I think I was relatively unusual because I had no background in the funeral industry at all when I started in the role, but also I was quite young, also being a younger woman as well. And I didn't know whether the judgment that I had from people when I told them what I did would be positive or negative, and as it turns out, it's both, depending on the other person. For me, I think it's important for a couple of reasons, and one of them is a purely practical reason, which is that we got designated as a key worker quite early on in the pandemic, and that was really, really important, because without that designation, for example, there would have been members of the team whose children wouldn't have been able to go to school, which would have meant that they would have struggled for childcare, which would have had a knock-on effect on their working lives. And we wouldn't have been able to feel, I had staff who said, oh, can we have a letter on letterhead paper that confirms that we're a key worker in case we get challenged, about why we're out and about? Because obviously, if you remember, no one was going anywhere in April or May last year if they didn't have to. But obviously, we can't work at home, so we still have to be going to and from work every day. But for me, there's a wider point, which is that if people understand a bit more about what funeral directors do and their place within communities, then the hope is that that will encourage them to start thinking about funerals a bit more broadly. And as you say, there is a reluctance to think about this, and I think this is a reluctance to talk about death in general, but also confront our own mortality specifically. And both of those present different challenges for different people. I'm quite comfortable talking about death and about funerals and bereavement, obviously, but the idea that you're not going to be here one day is still, scary and frightening. But I think it's understanding that the one doesn't cause the other. So I can do this, and talk to people about dying and funerals until the cows come home without it having any effect on my own mortality. And I think it's getting that connection together. I remember on one of my social media groups, which is nothing to do with death or bereavement or funerals at all, when the clap for carers was happening, someone who I have never met personally, but who knows me through that group and who knows what I do, actually tagged me in a post that said, tonight I'm going to be clapping for you, because it's not just carers, it's all key workers. And I know that you do a really important job. And I just thought, oh my God, a few years ago, no one would ever have done that, I don't think. And it was actually, it was really nice, because we were working really hard and it was a really, really tough time. And I don't want everyone to go, oh gosh, you're marvelous, because that's not the point, but just to understand that if we don't get that acknowledgement, it would have made things more difficult in that practical way that I first said. But I just really do hope that people seeing the work that funeral directors do, because we have never been on the news and talked about so much. We were obviously featured on Southeast Today. One of our customers who was very affected by the very early restrictions was very brave and talked about that experience, and actually let the BBC have some footage of her mum's funeral live streamed. And we were also interviewed as part of that, and firms all over the country have been working with the media to explain this part of the pandemic. And I do hope that it might encourage conversations a little bit. You don't have to sit down and talk about it for hours. It doesn't have to be, well, we always say, I guess, our themed leaflet is big deal, small talk, isn't it? So maybe it is a big deal, but you don't have to make a thing out of it. You can just say a couple of sentences to someone if you want.
Yeah, it has been very different for us being under the spotlight, as it were, and for me, in terms of handling our social media content and seeing things develop minute by minute sometimes, and sometimes hearing a story break over the weekend or one during an evening, when a funeral has hit the headlines, and it's unfortunately normally for the wrong reasons, because either they've been over the capacity that's allowed by the government, or there's been a breach of social distancing during the service, and it's caught on camera because of the webcasts now, and various other situations that have cropped up. And internally, as someone who deals with online communications, you're going, oh no, this has gone viral for the wrong reasons, and we're out here trying to push positive content. But it's still important that those difficult scenarios are shown, because I think it reminds people that there's a human element to it, and that this is incredibly hard, and that the most natural thing in the world. And we saw it with the outpouring of emotion for the Queen recently at her husband's funeral, when everyone suddenly realised, oh my goodness, she sat there by herself, and the astonishing amount of people that had already happened to in the year prior. And that I think suddenly people felt something for and recognised that for what it was really interesting. So yeah, it's been a kind of lifting the lid and looking behind the curtain for a lot of people, and I am really proud actually of how comfortable the public has been with taking that information on rather than continuing to shy away from it. I think there's been hopefully what is a really important step taken. So, as you said, I agree that it's very unfortunate that it's taken a pandemic for us to reach this point, but necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it? So here we are, and in a way, if it's possible to have gratitude for this situation, then that would definitely be some of mine. So as you noted earlier, we're a company that's been around for well over 100 years. We predate the telephone and the electric lights and the commonality of the indoor flushing toilet and the car and the internet. So innovation has been really important to our history because, as you also said, we take it very seriously to listen to customer feedback, and it's lovely when it's good, but equally there's a positive when it's not so good because that enables us to improve. And one of the ways we've done that is we launched our online tribute and donations platform back in August 2018, which now has been incredibly fortuitous because we now aren't able to take cash donations at funerals, and also with small attendances it's pretty fruitless, and it has meant that, again, it's a link that people can send around the world so that whether or not people want to donate, they can share memories, they can feel more connected. And the increase in donations that we've seen has been absolutely phenomenal. It surprises me every single month when I log on and see that there's been even more money generously donated in memory of these loved ones who have died. So how else do you think our ability to change our ways of working has supported our customers? We've already mentioned a couple of things with arranging funerals remotely and sharing information digitally, but I wondered if there's anything else in terms of innovation that you think has supported our customers during this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've done quite a few things. I mean, you mentioned the online donations, and obviously that was very important for us, and it was actually a really big decision for us to make because I think it was really one of the first times that we had sort of let another organisation be involved in something that was so fundamental to what we do. So obviously we would have used other companies to supply uniforms and supply the vehicles and build a website for us and all of those sorts of things, but this is actually something that has to integrate into our day-to-day procedures, and I think that is what I would always say about, we are innovative and we do want to bring things forward for people, but it always has to be right. We have to be very cognizant that we have a reputation, and we have to stand by the quality of what we're providing for people, whether it originates with us or not. I mean, a really good example would be something like our limousine service. So obviously that's something which people have always availed of themselves since a time when really motorized transport was available to people. So when you go back into our very early ledgers, you see transport for the close mourners to the person who has died, but that was something that we actually weren't able to do for quite a long time because we've never been in favour of the type of limousine where you have a partition between the driver and the people who he or she is carrying, because for a variety of reasons. I mean, after a funeral, they may wish to chat. There might be questions that the driver needs to practically ask, double check where they're going, or if there's any other, considerations, making sure that they've got everything. Sometimes people might want to listen to some music. And so we couldn't use them because we couldn't social distance. And when a company came along, who we know because they're a vehicle supplier, and actually said, we have got custom built screens that will fit in the cars that you already have. We really jumped upon that because we sort of thought, well, it's a really, really good compromise because they're sort of a see-through screen. So the driver is at least still able to have some connection with the passengers, but it means that we can restart that service, which is really important, particularly for some people who either don't have their own transport or wouldn't want to drive on the day for a lot of reasons. I mean, it's an emotional time, particularly after the service. If you're upset, you might not really be in the right frame of mind. So I think, you know, we wouldn't have got them from just anywhere or just anyone, but certainly realizing that they were from a reputable company, we did that and it's worked out really well. So that would be a good example. And I think other examples would just be, you know, researching, really, you know. So a lot of people over the past year, as you've said, have wanted to personalize things, and it's been things like vehicles, as you've said. So if someone says, oh, can we have an unusual vehicle, you know, we go away and we try and find out. And I suppose another thing would be that if someone wants an unusual coffin, you know, what is it that they would like? How can we get that for them? How can we make sure that the quality of it is appropriate to what they would like whilst meeting their other requirements? Because of course there are all kinds of things that we know about, you know, there's standards that have to be adhered to, particularly if someone's been cremated, in terms of things like that. So I think, and just, you know, again, as we've already said, just responding to people's feedback and really listening when people, you know, and people telling us the things that were important to them that they weren't able to do or that they really wanted to do. So one thing that I'm really proud of, and it's perhaps not innovative in and of itself, but considering what happened last year, is that we never stopped anyone from coming to see the person who had died in the chapel of rest. Now, a lot of funeral directors, that was something that they were worried about, and there was a stage early in the pandemic where we didn't actually know whether the person who had died presented a risk to us, but as soon as we established that that probably wasn't the case, that was something that we did that was really important. We've had a question.
Yes, I was going to pose that one to you.
Lovely.
So thank you, Claire, for the question. She has asked whether there's essentially whether there's a maximum or any legalities around length of time services can be made available online once they've taken place. So it's kind of, there's a little bit of data protection type stuff in there, I suspect.
Yeah. So I think what the most important thing to understand is really how these services work. So if you take an example, the most common live streaming would be in a crematorium chapel. And so what we would understand from that is that it's actually a whole third-party system. So it's neither attached to the crematorium nor to ourselves. So there are 2 or 3 different companies in the UK, the big ones, who run these services. And it is all done via secure cloud links. So basically what they will do is that they will provide a distinct link and password for access to viewing the service, and then that can be disseminated onwards, but obviously there is a level of protection because you only forward it on to people who you can trust. Now, some of them do offer a service which is called a 28-day rewatch, and so what that means is that the service exists on the cloud for 28 days afterwards, but that has to be specifically requested. Otherwise, the only way to watch again, if there isn't a rewatch facility, is to have asked for a sort of permanent keepsake, which might be in the form of a downloadable link, or it might be something physical, so a memory stick or a DVD. So I think it's important to understand that a person who has died in and of themselves is not subject to data protection. So for example, information about someone who has died is not confidential because your data is your own, and the way that the law works is that once you've died you're not a person in the same way, but it is quite heavily restricted because obviously any service is only able to be watched by those people who have had that link, and it's usually at the time of the funeral itself. So I hope that answers your question, Claire. And obviously, if anyone else has got any other questions, we have got a bit of time left. If you would like to ask, please do pop them into the chat.
Yeah.
Just seen a really lovely message from Jackie. So
Yeah.
that's so kind of you. Thank you.
So whilst we're waiting, just in case anyone wants to ask anything else, I will pose to you one last question, taking us back really to the theme of Dying Matters Awareness Week 2021, which has been, are you in a good place to die? So for yourself as a funeral director, Abby, if there were one thing that someone in need of arranging a funeral could do to make the process more straightforward, what would that be?
I mean, I think in an ideal world, they would have been brave enough to have had a conversation with the person who has died, and so to have a little bit of an idea about what some of their requirements might be. Now, I know that these conversations are really difficult for people, and particularly when it's people who are really close to you, who you really care about. The idea of their funeral is obviously really hard, because that means that they've died, and obviously you don't want that. But I think what it's really important to understand is that, again, going back to what we said earlier, it's not going to make it happen any quicker, but also it will make things easier for you at the time. We're acknowledging this is going to be a hard time for you, and having a dilemma about which ABBA song mum preferred, and arguing amongst yourselves about which one she would have liked better. Really, there are, other things that you can be doing. You can concentrate on your grief when some of those decisions have been made. But in terms of someone who is actually arranging a funeral in the here and now, for me, I think the most important thing is to obviously try to seek consensus from people, have conversations about what their thoughts are about all of the various different components. Certainly, I think that if you do decide to have a formal funeral service, working together on something like a eulogy can be really cathartic for people, but also it means that you get a much broader brushstroke of the person's life, in different times to where we are now. I remember, sadly, a few years ago now, one of our colleagues died. She had known that she was unwell, but she did die still in service with the company, and I'd obviously known her from the later stage of her life once we were working together. But obviously she had a whole period of her life before that. When I knew her, she had grown-up children, but obviously she'd been a mum to them when they were little, and all of that sort of stuff. And by having like a service that really reflected that had people talking about her early life, her earlier working life, and all of these kinds of things, it really made the funeral meaningful and personal to her. And I also just think, be really brave. If you want something, ask if it's possible. In the last year, funeral directors have had to say no to people an awful lot, which has been really hard because it's not what we do normally. And actually, to if you say, well, can I do this? The worst answer that you're going to get, certainly from us at Freeman Brothers, is either, well, I don't know, let me find out for you, or I don't know if you can do it in that way, but what are you trying to achieve from it, and let's find out how we can achieve that same thing for you. So I think it's really just about having clear views about what's wanted, and if you can find those out in advance, so you're able to take some of the preferences of the person who's died into that, then even better. But don't be frightened to do mad stuff. There's no reason why a funeral can't be a positive experience. We had someone do the time warp once in the crematorium chapel, led by the celebrant, and it was brilliant, and no one's ever going to forget it, are they? And I think that's really good. I think that's really important.
We've had a question from Jackie, which I will address in a moment. I just wanted to really quickly give my input to that concept of something that people can have done in advance to make the process more straightforward, and something that I'm hoping Abby's going to be really proud that I've actually listened to her over the last year, because Abby's favourite phrase, or one of, has been interrogate your beliefs. because we had been in the incredibly unfortunate situation of us having to say no to people due to social distancing regulations. It then came down to, what's your next plan? What's plan B? So it's all well and good having the ideal scenario mapped out, that you would like a big church service with lots of people and a wake afterwards for 30 people for a lovely big party and lots of drinking and dancing and sharing of memories. But unfortunately, as we have now seen, that can be taken away from you for reasons completely outside of your control. This has been a slight issue in the past anyway, because one of the common places that we saw this situation previously was people who had filled in all the paperwork and said that they wanted to donate their body to medical science. And again, unfortunately, because of reasons outside of their control, for something as inconsequential as the date upon which your life ends, you may be rejected by the medical school. And obviously that can be of absolutely no fault of your own, completely outside of your control. And in that scenario, we have had people floundering and going, oh, but that's what that person desperately wanted, and now I don't know what to do. So as unfortunate as it may be to think about, having a plan B of, and without getting too worst case scenario about it and going, oh, well, what if there's a zombie apocalypse as well as a pandemic? It is important to say, ideally, I would like this, and here's where you can make compromises if necessary, or if you really, really need to. So, Jackie's
sorry, Becky,
question.
just before we do Jackie's question, can I just add to that? I think if people understand why people want what they want, then that's actually really helpful, because if you understand the motivations behind something, which does necessitate that slightly deeper conversation than just what do you want, okay, done, but then if you understand why, then you can perhaps achieve the same thing in a different way, and so perhaps thinking about things in a slightly more conceptual way, the sort of spirit you're trying to convey and that sort of thing. Sorry to interrupt you. Carry on. Sorry.
No, that's fine. So Jackie's question, in case anyone hadn't seen it, was whether it's possible to plan your own funeral down to the last detail so that other people aren't in the position of having to do that. And the very short answer is yes. And there are a couple of different ways which will suit different people. And the simplest of which is to simply write out all of your wishes and let someone know what they are. We have a leaflet which can help you to do that. I'm happy, it's hosted on our website, and we have physical copies that we could post to you as well. It's called our Big Deal Small Talk leaflet, which Abby mentioned earlier. And it's actually very short but very comprehensive, because you can fill out the details. It guides you through the prompts, the decisions that need to be made, and you can detail it as much or as little as you like. So, for example, my sister's wish is that the people who are going to be attending or organising her funeral make those decisions, because she believes that funerals are for the living, and therefore she doesn't want to be prescriptive, and she wants them to do what is the right thing for their bereavement process when it comes to the time at which she dies. Others of us, some of whom are present on the call, are incredibly particular about their wishes and have therefore written down every single last detail, just as Jackie has described, and are leaving those instructions with someone to carry them out in the event of their death. So you can run the gamut in between as well. If it's that, we very often have people saying, I can't bear the thought of being buried, I don't want to be in with the worms or in a box, so I must be cremated. And equally, there are people who are very strongly averse to cremation, and each decision is our own, and the reasons behind that are not important to us as funeral directors. Our desire is that you get the funeral that is right for you and that you want. So outlining your wishes is a fantastic first step. The only thing you must do is make sure that someone has quick and easy access to those wishes. A lot of people think that the best thing to do is to leave it with your will. It's not, because the will often be handled after the funeral has taken place. So the best thing to do is, if you think your executor and your solicitor is going to be organising the funeral, that's great. Leave the funeral wish details with them. If it's likely to be someone else, make sure that they have got those details and that they know who to call and who to contact in the event of your death. If you want to take things a step further, you can take out a prepaid funeral plan. And I will hand over to Abby to discuss that a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. So there are various different companies that offer prepaid funeral plans, national companies that offer them, funeral directors also sell them, sometimes on behalf of their own plan and sometimes on behalf of larger providers. So Freeman Brothers has a prepaid funeral plan. We've had it for about 30 years now, and there are various different ways that plans work, but how ours work is that we have 5 tiers of plan, and if what you want fits straightforwardly into one of those, it's at a fixed cost, or you can tailor make a plan which is entirely bespoke to you. The cost of that is either fixed in the tiers or as calculated, and then basically you pay, and it's at today's rate. The money is then sent to an independent trust and held in trust and invested, so that the value of it increases over time. And then at the time that you die, it's basically the trust reimburses us for the arrangements that were specified. And you can go into as much or as little detail as you want in one of those plans. So we do have people who have prepaid their funeral, and accompanying their application form is sort of a file about this big of A4 notes of music, readings, venue, route to take from our branch to the venue, and all of these sorts of things. We've got people who have planned it down to the minute detail. I think what's important to understand is that if you've prepaid, people need to know, largely because they don't want to pay twice if you've done it already. But different funeral plans are different. So ours are fully guaranteed, and we will never ask for anything that's been covered in the plan to be paid for again, even if costs go up an awful lot. Some plans are maybe cheaper at the outset because not everything might be covered in full, or some things might not be covered at all. So some providers will offer a prepaid funeral plan where the only thing that's covered, you basically pay now for the funeral director's services, and if they go up by less than a certain amount, it will be covered. But all of the third party costs, so the cremation fee if it's a cremation funeral, or the opening of a plot if it's a burial funeral, will need to be paid at the time that you die. And actually that might work really well for you because it's probably cheaper at the outset, and if you have got a smaller sum, it at least protects it to a certain degree. So we just encourage people to compare between providers, and it should always be 100% clear and transparent to you what you're getting and what will have to be paid for later. Prepaid funeral plans are shortly going to be regulated, so they will be a financial services product like any insurance or other investment, which is a significant change for the industry. But that will mean that those people who haven't been so good at telling people what is included will have to be much better at it. But they are good, but they do require you to have a sum of money, which obviously doesn't suit everybody. And so, as Becky says, even just writing down what it is that you want and making sure that someone knows about it is a really good first step in lieu of a conversation. I mean, I'd always encourage sitting down and chatting about it over a cup of tea, but if you can't write it down, then it's there, isn't it? And last thing that I would say, really crucially, make sure that everyone who might be involved in arranging the funeral knows these things and that you're consistent with your wishes. We have had cases where people, I think, in trying to be kind to their friends and family, have had different conversations with different people, and much as it feels kind at the time, I think it just causes more problems later, because if me and Becky are both trying to arrange someone's funeral and we both think that we know what they wanted and that it's important to do it, but that it's the opposite from each other, it's just making things very hard. Oh, thanks,
Oh,
Claire.
thank you, Claire, for that kind comment. She says we've been brilliant. That's so nice to hear, because it is the first time that we've done this just together.
Yeah.
So that was a really great answer about prepayment plans. I've popped the link to our Big Deal Small Talk leaflet in the chat there in case anyone wants it. And if you would like copies, just please do email me. You should all have my email address. We're approaching midday, so I will close things off there. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us today. Thank you for Abby for all of the information that she has provided and the conversation that we have been able to have. I've really enjoyed it. It's so nice to share with other people a little bit about what we do. If anyone thinks of any questions afterwards, again, just drop us an email. We're always happy to provide help and advice free of charge, without obligation. That's what we are there for, to continue our mission of demystifying bereavement and funerals and the industry. We are all about openness and transparency.